Okay, great. Well, let's get started. I see a couple of people are on the Zoom session, so thank you everyone for joining us. For folks who don't know me, my name is Rich Lee. I'm the Executive Director of the Giandoli Institute and an Associate Professor of Journalism in the Giandoli School of Communications. This is our Media Studies Across Disciplines project, which has just started. Our first essay was posted Tuesday. It's by Barry Gant, who we're going to hear from in a little bit. Just in short, the project is one where we're trying to get different perspectives from people in different academic disciplines about journalism. I've had the opportunity to read all the papers. Going to be posting a paper every Tuesday through mid-August, and there's some really great essays in there. I'm going to hear the first one tonight. Some of the authors, including Barry, have agreed to do presentations like we're going to hear tonight, which I'm trying to model roughly after presentations at academic conferences. So Barry will spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes on his paper. We'll open it up, we have a panel, and then we'll, open it up to Q&A from everyone else. Just before we start, just wanted to thank a couple of people. Obviously wanted to thank Barry and the other authors who contributed work to the project. It's funded by the Leo E. Keenan Faculty Development Endowment and the Giandoli School of Communication. Want to thank the panel, which is, I'll introduce them in more detail later when we get to that point, but it's Lee Coppola, Kevin Lerner, and Chuck Polino. Also want to thank the folks who have signed on to, either live or hope to record. I think I am recording this, so we'll, have the recording on now. Just a couple of things about format before we start. If everyone can keep your microphones muted, that would be great while Barry talks, while the panel talks. For folks who are not on the panel, when we open it up, might be best to use the chat feature. Either put your question in a chat or just send me a message saying, I have a question, and I'll call on you just so we can kind of maintain some semblance of order there. So I think that takes care of all the housekeeping things. So Barry, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rich. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I had been posting observations to Facebook for lack of someplace else to post them. And when this opportunity arose, I saw fit to take a couple of my Facebook posts and integrate them with some other thoughts I had and do something a little more substantial, but not too substantial, as you'll see. I'm going to share my screen with you now and pull up a short PowerPoint I put together, which summarizes the paper that the panelists, I presume, have probably read at this point. And I need to learn how to move. There we go. So I titled this True Falsehoods, Distortion in the News Media. And I'll just summarize briefly what I had to say. As a philosopher, I spend a lot of time talking about thinking clearly. I teach critical thinking, and also part of that critical thinking involves teaching the differences between deductive and inductive reasoning. Socrates, who really got Western philosophy rolling, although he wasn't the first Western philosopher, focused largely on deductive reasoning and trying to show people that some of the beliefs that they had often contradicted other beliefs that they had, and that they needed to think things out a little more clearly, assuming that the world is a rational place. And so Plato's dialogues, which capture Socrates historically and go beyond the historical Socrates, attempt to teach people not to go beyond the evidence, to simply draw inferences from what evidence they have, and don't think things that you don't have evidence for. I mentioned Sherlock Holmes, who's not a philosopher, but just a fictional character, who relies largely on what's called inductive reasoning, where you draw probabilistic conclusions from empirical evidence. Typically what one does is you might have a statistical generalization, like 90% of people at Bonaventure are Catholic, so-and-so goes to Bonaventure, therefore he's probably Catholic. That's not a certain conclusion, but it's a legitimate conclusion if we're talking about the 90th percentile in statistical inference. You can also go in the other direction and say from gathering specific bits of information about a population draw a conclusion about the larger population. And this is what polling does. So those are legitimate forms of inference. But what I want to argue is that increasingly, and I would say mostly since around 1995 or so, when Fox News really got going, and perhaps from the 80s when you had people like Rush Limbaugh on the radio doing talk radio, there's been pressure from the left and pressure from the right to present different viewpoints that I think has colored the way news is presented in the country by news outlets, and colored it in a way that makes it difficult for readers and viewers to get the balance and objectivity that we used to expect, and I suppose we still expect, but don't get so much in the media. So I began my short paper with one example. This is from the New York Post, which had a headline that said, Senate Democrats block $250 billion for coronavirus small business loans. And on that same day, the New York Times wrote, the U.S. Senate is in stalemate on new aid for small businesses. Now, the fact of the matter was that Republicans had introduced a bill for $250 in small business loans, and there was at the same time a bill in the House that the Democrats wanted to introduce for $250 billion in additional unemployment benefits and hospital support and so forth. And so they were blocked by the Republicans from introducing this part of the bill, and the headlines could just as easily have read, it's not bad what the New York Times says, it's in a stalemate, but it wasn't a stalemate just about small business, it was also a stalemate about money for hospitals and additional money for unemployment. So the Post headline could have read, Senate Republicans block $250 billion for hospital aid, but it didn't say that. And nor should it have said that. Both papers should have come down somewhere in between. Now, the New York Post is regularly regarded as a bit more right-wing than the New York Times, and rightly so, I would say. And the New York Times is often regarded as on the left side of the political spectrum. But I want to argue here that this type of headline is actually on the right side of the spectrum. They really should have been more in the center, and they weren't. Now, their headline really leaned toward the right here, and they often do. So that's one example. I want to give a second example that's in the paper. I'll give you one that's not in the paper in a moment. About the same time, Fox News had a headline, Coronavirus Bill Hits Hurdles as Sanders Threatens to Stall Package Over Bid to Change Unemployment Aid. Now, it says hurdles, but it doesn't mention what all the hurdles are. The other hurdle was that 4 Republican senators, before Sanders said anything, threatened to stall the package because they didn't like that the unemployment aid was greater in many instances than what people were earning when they were employed. And they didn't like that part of the bill, and so they were going to stall the bill. And Sanders says, well, if you're going to stall the bill over that, I'm going to stall the bill over not monitoring carefully how corporations are spending the money that we're giving to them. So Sanders wasn't the first to raise objections to the bill. He was the first on the Democratic side, perhaps, but it was a response to Republicans. And you could just as easily have said Republicans threatened to stall the package. And also this little phrase, bid to change unemployment aid, it was a effort to reduce unemployment aid. Fox News could have said it that way. That would have been accurate. But by saying change, it favors the Republicans a little bit who wanted to reduce the unemployment aid. At the same time, CNN had a headline, said Nancy Pelosi begins talk of next coronavirus relief bill as she tells House Democrats to recognize the good in the stimulus. And as I mentioned in the short paper, CNN here is, I think, trying to make Pelosi look good by focusing on how she wants to encourage people to recognize the good in the stimulus. But my point is that the words recognize the good are Pelosi's words. CNN is just quoting her. The word threaten to stall package by Fox News is not a quote from Sanders. That's a word that Fox News used. Fox News also used the word torpedo the bill, which is not a word that Sanders used either. So I give CNN a little bit more credit here, but they have a little bias because obviously they're trying to paint the Democrats in a better light than Fox News is here. And Fox News is actually going out of their way to paint them in a negative light. And I think falsely so in this instance. This is an example that I didn't have in the paper, but I just throw it in. It's a little more recent. It's from a friend of mine who wrote the New York Times complaining a couple of weeks ago that, I don't know how many of you have seen clips from the Plandemic movie, but it's a movie that challenges most of the assumptions about coronavirus, and it's coming from someone who purports to be a former associate of Anthony Fauci, but the video is pretty distorted. At any rate, the New York Times, in reporting on this, calls it a slickly produced narration that wrongly claimed. And my friend points out to the New York Times, why did you use the word slickly instead of professionally produced? Because those words would have said the same thing, but slickly has the negative connotation. And the negative connotation might have been okay if they had done anything to show why the claims were wrong, but they didn't. They just quoted people who said they were wrong and never offered evidence about what was wrong about the claims. So my friend took great exception to that, even though he subscribes to the New York Times. The fourth example that I give is the second half of my short paper, where I argue that one of the biggest problems with bias in news reporting, and Lee, you may remember this from when we team taught a course in news media ethics. One of my big shticks there was that it's not so much what is reported as what is not reported in the news. So the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, and Fox News reported one day on their front pages that Vice President Pence did not wear a mask when touring a faculty. I think he was in Michigan at the time. And on the same day, the Washington Post carried another story, but not on the front page. It was on the front page of his business section. And that story said that the US administration was planning $500 billion loan to major US corporations with no stipulations about how they had to spend that money whatsoever. And if I'm not mistaken, the story was not carried by the other news media outlets in subsequent days either. To be perfectly fair to these other outlets, this report by the Washington Post came from an interview, an exclusive interview that they had with someone from the Trump administration. But in subsequent days, these outlets did not carry that story. That's a big deal if you're going to give $500 billion to corporations with no stipulation. So to conclude and allow time for panelists and other discussion, I'll say the news media in our country, including what many regard as the best of the media, have taken increasingly to slanting their news stories and by their choice of stories, as well as by their headlines and what they choose to report in the media's preferred directions, whether left, right, or center. Then I add, and I do this a little tongue-in-cheek, such editorializing threatens the basis of our democracy, which relies upon fairness in reporting to an educated citizenry. It needs to be reined in. Now, this wasn't in my original paper. And the reason it wasn't in there is this is what I believe, but it's not supported by the evidence I've just given you. I need additional evidence to reach that conclusion. So if I were to add this, as I just did, but I put it in red, I'd be doing the very same thing I'm accusing the media of doing. And I just wanted to point out to you that it's very easy to do that because in my mind, I've proved that, but I really haven't. I'm going beyond the evidence when I make this assertion in red. And to leave time for everyone to talk, I'll stop here. Oh, I think you're muted, Rich.
Yeah, Richard, you're muted.
Okay. Yeah, thanks,
Rich,
Barry. I'm glad you added that point at the end because it shows how easy it is to kind of slip into these habits and things like that.
And Rich, I might do one other thing, if I may.
Sure.
One other screen share. I forgot about something I wanted to share with you. Let's see. So let me stop this share and start another share. This is a PowerPoint. Where is it? A PowerPoint I did.
Hands. Jen Dolan.
a media class at Bonaventure, and where I showed students what I call the political spectrum in the U.S. media. Am I sharing that with you yet or not?
No.
Not seeing it yet.
Not seeing it. Let's see what's going on here. Try this again. Share screen. Maybe now. Is that there?
Yeah, seeing it now.
Okay, so this is just a spectrum that I drew up off the top of my head and presented to journalism and mass communication students at Bonaventure a couple of years ago. And I like to portray the political spectrum as a kind of horseshoe. I think the farther to the right you get, you almost touch base if you go farther to the left. So on the extreme end, if you were to look at, say, this slide, you could see communists and fascists having a lot in common, and left-wing anarchists and right-wing anarchists having a lot in common. And if we apply that to the political spectrum, I wouldn't say the nation is anything like Breitbart News, but if you start going further to the left with media, you might get something similar to Breitbart News. I also put the New York Times a little bit to the right here, mainly because we like to think of Democrats and Republicans, Democrats being a little to the left and Republicans being a little bit to the right, and the center is right between them. But I think that's skewed. If you go most other places in the world, what we call the Democratic Party in this country would be a little bit to the right. So I stick ABC News sort of center, and CNN, LA Times a little bit to the left, New York Times, Wall Street Journal slightly to the right, and you can see how else I go there. That's for what it's worth.
Okay. No, thanks. Those charts are interesting. I think they could lead to a whole new set of questions. So.
Well, yeah, and I could just to share one more thing with you quickly here. This is a. I can pull it up. Shut that down again and screen. There we go. This is a more sophisticated chart that some of you may have seen. And it goes not only left to right, but top to bottom in terms of how much original fact reporting goes on by the number of reporters one has to actually cover stories versus a number of so-called media outlets that actually don't have any reporters covering stories, and they're just gathering stuff from elsewhere and commenting on it and claiming it's news. But anyway, I'll leave it at that now, Rich. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Let me, I said I was going to introduce the panelists a bit more. Lee Coppola is a former dean of the Giandoli School of Communication. If you're from Western New York, you also know Lee's work from the many years he spent in print and broadcast journalism. Kevin Lerner is an assistant professor of journalism at Marist. As I said before, does a lot of work, great work at Marist. Also outside of, some research work, he does a lot of great writing. And Chuck Polino was the editor of the News Tribune and the Home News Tribune in New Jersey. And I told the panelists I was going to go in a certain order, but Chuck already told me he had a question. So Chuck, I'll let you go first with your question.
I just wanted to ask if Barry could talk a little more about what he thinks are the origins of this phenomenon that he's describing.
Well, I mentioned some of what I think the origins are. I think they got their start, not their start, but they really got a big push forward with talk radio of the 80s and 90s, in particular folks like Rush Limbaugh. And then when Fox News, when CNN came on with 24-hour news with cable TV, that was a problem too, because then you had this news hole that you had to fill. And if you couldn't fill it, you'd find things to fill it with. And so I think when we moved from weeklies to dailies and dailies to hourlies and and so on, the more quickly you need to fight to report the news, the less accurate the news reporting is, the bigger a news hole you have to fill, and you have to meet an advertising budget as well. But I would say largely cable TV in the 70s, talk radio in the 80s, and then Fox News in the mid-90s, being countered a little later by MSNBC. And it's gone from bad to worse, I would say. Not with them in particular, but with all over the spectrum. Does that help, Chuck?
Yeah, it does.
What do you think?
To what extent, well, I agree with that. And to what extent do you think um, the transformation of news people into personalities um, has affected the whole news media, all the news media, even those that are not engaged in CNN broadcasting, for example? Um,
It was easier in the days of radio. um, you know, the Green Party in Germany has a principle of not allowing the faces of their political candidates to be shown in any of their advertising, only their positions. So much of it is media hype at this point. It's unfortunate.
I'd like to kind of throw that to Lee because you went from being a print journalist to like a highly visible television journalist. Did you feel like you made that transformation into a personality?
Well, I used to speak at a lot of gatherings because I was a television reporter, and I would be introduced as a television personality. And I would tell the audience right off the bat, I'm not a personality. I'm a journalist, damn it. What I do is I gather news and I report it. I'm not a personality. I'm not here. I'm not a star. I'm not a celebrity. I'm a journalist. And I kept emphasizing that over and over. But the audience always pictured me as some sort of a celebrity, some sort of a personality. When you work for a newspaper, which I did for 16 years, you have your byline, but who the hell reads bylines except your family and your friends? When you go on television, people know your face. I mean, you go to the store, you go to a restaurant, especially the station I worked for, which was #1 in the ratings. People were coming all over, up to me when I was out with my wife or my family, talking to me and asking for autographs. And I would, I'd have to concur, but I felt awkward doing it because I kept saying, I'm a journalist. Go get an autograph from your school teacher or your nurse or your doctor or somebody who's really critical to your life. I mean, I'm critical as a journalist because I provide you information, but I'm not critical for you to live. And those people are critical to your education and to your livelihood. So, yeah, I found it, I'm a slob. I used to try and go out on Saturday dressed in old clothes, and my wife would yell at me and say, people are going to think you're a slob. And I'm going to say, but I am a slob, but it's the problem, the curse. Someone asked me, what's the most difficult thing of being a television reporter? And my answer was being on television, because all I wanted to do was get information and report it. But you had to do it on television so people looked at your face. And I think that corrupts the whole business in a way, because it leads to this whole idea that you're a celebrity, you make more money, your station gets more ratings. Newspaper reporters now are on television all the time, giving their opinions, which to me is absurd and ridiculous. They're supposed to report in an unbiased fashion as much as possible. And I agree with Barry in a lot of ways that is not happening. And it sickens me to read major metropolitan newspapers and see the slant they put on stories. So that's basically my take on what's happening. But I disagree, Barry. In small towns, newspapers, and I can't speak for television stations, but I started working for the Buffalo Evening News in 1967. It was strictly a Republican paper. If you were a Democrat, you didn't get your story in the paper. If you were Black, you didn't get on the society pages. And so that was a discriminatory and racist thing that was happening way back in the 60s and the 70s. The publisher of the Buffalo Evening News was a counselor to the governor of New York State. That's absurd, but that's what was happening.
Okay, great. Kevin, I'm going to throw to you. We've heard from two longtime veteran journalists. Maybe you can bring a different perspective to the conversation.
Sure. I held my tongue a little bit when we were talking about history because when I first read the paper, I thought, well, we're going to be talking about the epistemology of journalists, which is something I've always been interested in, but I'll leave the epistemology to the philosopher. And then I thought we'd also be talking about ethics, because this is somewhere in that line between epistemology and ethics. And you certainly get ethics courses in mass communication programs, but I'm a historian. I'm a historian of the press. And one thing that I've become very interested in is this history of the idea of objectivity and the idea of an unbiased press, because I was trained as a journalist before I was trained as a historian. And the first thing that happened to me when I went to journalism school, I got a master's in journalism immediately after undergraduate, which, if I wanted to be a journalist, was a terrible idea. The fact that I ended up becoming an academic is a big part of that is because I went straight into a master's program in journalism, and it didn't do what I was hoping it would do. I was hoping it would give me this platform to think deeply about what journalism was and why we were doing it and what its role was. But it was really just training people for entry-level jobs at newspapers. This was 20 years ago. Yeah, exactly 20 years ago I graduated. So that was frustrating to me, but it had always seemed to me that objectivity, being unbiased, being fair, playing it straight down the middle, that these were the universal ideals of journalism. But then as I started studying the history of it, and this is something Lee sort of hinted at when he was talking about the Buffalo newspaper, the Republican newspaper in Buffalo, the idea of being unbiased, objective, and that there is a mainstream media is a relatively recent phenomenon historically, and it's a particularly American phenomenon historically. So the history of journalism luckily parallels American history in the timeline pretty well. So there's not a whole lot of journalism before colonial America started. But the first newspapers in what would become the United States were nothing like what we would think of as objective. They were essentially the personal playthings of the publishers who owned them, right? So Ben Franklin or Alexander Hamilton funded a paper, and he wrote opinion articles anonymously that he then published and then would cite as support for his arguments when he would make them in public. And then after we became the United States, up until at least the 1830s, newspapers were even more nakedly partisan than that. Newspapers would accuse Andrew Jackson of being a murderer, rightly, as it turns out. But they would, my favorite is that some of the partisan press, which were all funded by the political parties, would not even mention the name of the other party's candidate on the idea that just having that name out there might mean somebody would accidentally vote for that person. They just completely ignore their opponents. And it wasn't really until the middle of the 19th century that we even started to get anything approaching this idea of a general set of fact for everybody. And in fact, this idea of fact being distinguishable from verifiable fact being distinguishable from any other kind of truth was really a modern invention in the history of ideas. So as we start to get the rise of the social sciences at the end of the 19th century, people thinking like, well, we could study the brain or the mind, how that works. We could study management principles and apply scientific methods to that. Objectivity as an ideal for journalism begins to emerge at the end of the 19th century and takes hold sometime in the early 20th century as an ideal. And it was partly because of this social science idea, and it was partly economic, right? If you could write news that would appeal to people on the left and the right, you could sell more newspapers, if you weren't going to offend those people. This also ties in with the Associated Press and the fact that news organizations started sharing news. If you were going to publish something that came from the Republican newspaper in Boston, it wasn't going to work in the Federalist newspaper in New York, or as parties developed, that changed. So as that starts to broaden, we get this, and then by the middle of the 20th century, that sort of gets established as the norm. So when I talk to journalists who've lived their whole lives in this period, it seems like this is the way it's always been and this is the way it should be. But if you travel to other countries, you know what newspaper you're picking up when you pick up the labor newspaper or the conservative newspaper. You know the point of view you're getting. And there have been constant pushbacks from journalists as they come into the newsroom to this idea of objectivity. In my book, I wrote about Tony Lucas, who was the New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning reporter who went on and became a magazine and book author. And he was covering the conspiracy trial of the Chicago 7 after the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention. And the Times, you know, as I think you point out rightly, Barry, was at least small c conservative, right? They're an institution. They don't like to cause trouble. They're very much tied in with power structures in the United States. And so they're at least small c conservative, if not capital C conservative on the right. And they're telling Tony Lucas when he's out there that he needs to cover this trial as a criminal trial. The government says it is a criminal trial. You need to cover this as a criminal trial. And as he was there, he became increasingly frustrated. He said, this is not a criminal trial. This is a political show trial. And I need to be able to say that. And the Times said, you can't say that because you don't have, as you say, enough evidence to say that. But his personal observation of that was that it was this political show trial. And so this is 50 years ago now, but this was one of the last big pushbacks to this idea of institutional objectivity. And when we look at the history of journalism too, there are all of these things that are on fringes of this. While you've had the New York Times or CBS News, ABC News, big broadcast networks, national publications, you at the same time, you're going to have the black press, the labor press, the abolitionist press, right? There's newspapers that are pushing particular points of view. And so I think that's a really important undercurrent that's going on all at the same time. I mean, I've got a couple other questions for you too that come out of the paper, but I can leave it at the historical rant for now and get those when we move into the discussion section.
Okay, great. I just wanted to get some thoughts on, you mentioned objectivity being something relatively new. One of the debates in journalism today is, should journalists be activists? And Lee, you wrote something recently about the New York Times op-ed where you kind of, got into that question. I'd like to hear you, and I'd also like to hear from Chuck too on that topic.
Yeah, well, basically it stemmed from the Cotton op-ed piece in the New York Times and the brouhaha that it caused at the Times itself, and obviously led to the resignation of the editorial page editor. And in discussing it with my wife and with friends, I was kind of torn by that whole imbroglio because it was an op-ed piece. It was on op-ed page. And I think, as I said in the piece I wrote for the Institute, in my opinion, the way to solve it was to offer someone with an opposing view to write another op-ed page, or piece rather, because that's what op-ed pages are for. It's as many sides of the spectrum as you want to put on and give everybody a chance in an op-ed page to say what they want to say. But as far as being an activist, I still am old school. I'm still not going to go and go downtown with the sign that says Black Lives Matter, even if I believe it, because I just don't think that journalists should be in that light. I used to tell my students, I don't put bumper stickers on my car. I don't put signs on my lawn. I don't host fundraisers, and I don't donate to campaigns, which is a real blessing too, because I can tell everybody else, I'm a journalist, I can't get money. So those are the kinds of things that in these days and age now, I'm questioning whether or not journalists should be more active. And if they're more active in the medium that they work in, that troubles me even more because it goes back to what Barry is saying. And, are they slanting the news even more based on their activist point of view?
Chuck, what are your thoughts? I mean, I know things are different now than they were when we worked together, but do you see those, kind of policies loosening where journalists can be more active than they were, say, 20, 30 years ago?
Well, yes, and I agree with everything that Lee just said. And it bothers me, for instance, when I see reporters, NPR reporters, for example, posting their personal opinions in their Twitter accounts. Because once you've done that, you've compromised, at least in people's perception of you, the idea that you can objectively cover whatever the subject matter was of your recent comment about your own opinion. So I agree with what Lee said. It may be old school, but there's a reason why it existed in the old school, which, as Kevin points out, is actually the new school. But but I think that, you know, that's where we finally found our ground in journalism, when we were able to make those distinctions. And I think if you want to be a journalist, then decide that that's what you want to do. If you want to be an activist, then do something else for a living and be an activist, because it's like a ministry. You take it on, you take what goes with it. I was going to mention to Kevin also that I did a lot of research in graduate school on the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson, and I read the trial, which went on for 11 weeks, and a lot of the testimony in that trial was given by newspaper reporters, and the partisan character of the press was right out there for everybody to see, because a lot of the testimony was about how could two reporters cover the president's speech in Cleveland, and one file this report and one file that report when they heard the same speech. And a little trivial thing that was pointed out during the trial was that in St. Louis at that time, the Missouri Republican was the Democratic paper and the Missouri Democrat was the Republican paper.
Okay, I know Kevin had a couple more comments, but Barry, do you want to chime in on this topic before we, get to Kevin's questions?
I'll keep it brief. Kevin, I appreciate your pointing out what I used to know and had forgotten, that it was the rise of large dailies that had to appeal to larger masses that led to this concept of objectivity and fairness. I think you're very right about that. I think what remains, though, is that we have even larger dailies now, in terms of the internet. And so the question is, are there responsibilities that come when you are speaking to a larger population? And I think there are. And so when Fox News talks about Sanders trying to torpedo a bill, I think that's really more than a distortion. It's just not fact. He wasn't trying to torpedo the bill, not at all. So Fox News can choose what stories it wants to report, and they can choose stories perhaps that have their slant, and the New York Times and MSNBC can choose the stories they want to focus on. But whatever stories they're choosing to get to their readers, they better not be saying false things in those stories. And I was a little disturbed to hear you say something about there not being truths. I did try to write a paper 2 years ago in which the title of the paper was "What is a Fact?" And I confess that I could not nail it. But I do think it's false, nonetheless, that Sanders, for example, was trying to torpedo that bill. And so I think we can say certain statements are true or false. And I think regardless of the slant of a newspaper or any medium, you have an obligation to tell the truth.
I mean, I don't disagree with that. I am unmuted, right? I do think that, so one of the the little Bible I bring to my classes is The Elements of Journalism by Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel, which is a great little, I think it's under 250 pages probably. You can get a paperback copy for $2. They say that the first principle of journalism is truth. Truth is the first, most important, but also most confusing principle. And I think it gets at a lot of the same things you get at in this essay, because they're trying to differentiate between fact, which they say is the bedrock of journalism, right? Fact is the first thing that a journalist has to deal with, but that fact is something less than truth. And then they go into a really interesting and poorly described example of a New York Giants football game. And it's weird because they pick a score that's a very unlikely score for football every time I go to it. But the fact is the Giants won the game by a score of, it's like 8-6 or something. And then they say everything beyond that, once you start doing storytelling, you're making choices. You're making choices to explain what happened over the course of the game. Now you can say, this was ruled a touchdown, this was ruled a field goal. But why did the Giants win? And the truth of why the Giants won is not a question that a journalist can really answer. Did they win because they were better prepared? Did they win because the coaching was better? Did they win because the weather was on their side? Did they win because the referees were biased toward them? Did they win because God favored them in the game? And some of these things are really hard to know, but I think for a journalist, and this is where I think about epistemology, at some point you have to make a decision about the best possible version of the truth you can get on any day, right? So in your paper, you talk about this bus, and I would say the bus that is across the road, that in and of itself is a story. But I think that a journalist who is on, I don't know what the appropriate beat for that would be, the road, maybe it's a traffic beat, can rely on his or her experience and knows that, well, when a bus is blocking the road, there's more to it than the fact that somebody parked a bus across the road and the traffic can't get past. So I think that at some point you have to make those decisions. One question that came up when I was reading that first part, which journalists have dealt with over the last 3 years or so, is when can you call somebody a liar? When can you say that somebody has lied? And I think by the standards of verification that you've got here, you just can't. As a journalist, you could never be inside somebody's mind and know intent. You'd never be able to get to that point. So the thing that I think about all the time is, what is the epistemology of a journalist? How can they make enough decisions that bus being parked across the road becomes a story and not just a fact? Because I think journalists they have to move toward a story at some point.
Okay, Chuck, you sent a note. You have a comment. I don't know if we're still on where you wanted to comment, but go ahead.
Well, you moved past it, but I'm going to just comment on what Keith was just talking about. I've noticed in the print media and also on broadcast, but I'm just going to talk about print now, that the Times and other major publications will frequently say, President Trump said falsely yesterday, and the Times several times has said that he lied, and once used the word liar in a headline. Now, I agree that they should not be using that terminology. They should show that what he said contradicts what is observable fact. And if they can't show that, then they shouldn't say that. And but you see it more and more now. And of course, I mean, to be fair, he creates the atmosphere in which this occurs. But that doesn't relieve us of our responsibility in reporting on it. On the other hand, I noticed in the reporting of his comments about using disinfectants and ultraviolet light, that was and continues to be misreported. So to make him say that people should, in recommending to people that they ingest some kind of disinfectant, he never did. If you read what he said in his actual words in that conversation, it was stream of consciousness, just words falling out, but no point did he say that anybody should do that. And yet the news media, both print and broadcast, have repeatedly said, especially in headlines, that he recommended to people that they ingest the disinfectants. In fact, I think the company that manufactures Lysol had to issue some kind of a disclaimer because of that, and it was bad reporting.
Okay, thanks. I want to open up the conversation to the other folks who are on the session. I don't know if anybody has a question or a comment, or if not, we can continue with the panel. I see a message from Judy in the chat. I mean, Judy, did you have a question or? No. Perhaps not. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Well, if not, we can, continue with the panel. And again, if anyone who's on the session wants to get a question in there, just send me a chat message. But Barry, you've been listening a lot to all these comments. I mean, Does it make you rethink anything about your paper?
I just think I like the distinctions that Kevin had made. I remembered them from when I used to teach news media ethics, but I'd forgotten them in recent years. So that's useful. Following up upon what Chuck just said, recently Trump had claimed that he was not involved in the firing of Berman in New York City, and the Attorney General Barr had said that he had ordered it, and that's sufficient. You know, you don't need to call Trump a liar or Barr a liar. All you need to do is report that Barr said this and Trump said this, and they contradicted each other, and let intelligent people make up their minds about what's going on. That's one way in which one can get closer to the truth while reporting facts.
Is there an obligation to figure out who's right when two statements contradict each other then? Should the journalist be trying to figure out, not necessarily that somebody is lying, but what is the correct state of facts, rather than just saying, Trump said this, Barr said that? Who knows? Shouldn't it be, Trump said this, Barr said that, we're working to figure out who's right?
I think it's a mistake if journalism and journalists simply resort to saying, he said this, he said that. There's got to be a critical examination of what was said and a willingness to go further. But as I was mentioning earlier, this half-hour news cycle, 24/7, sort of precludes that sort of investigative journalism. My hometown paper, the Olean Times-Herald, when I moved here, had 23, 26 reporters on its staff and a fairly large news hole. And now they have somewhere between 5 to 7 news reporters full-time on their staff, and a much larger advertising space and a much smaller news hole, and much less time for those 5 or 7 reporters to gather all the news that 23 of them used to. So it becomes difficult, but this is another example from the Times-Herald. The people who used to own it, the Fitzpatricks, I think they required a 5% profit margin out of it, and they were one of the wealthiest families in Olean. But now the company that owns it is looking for 35 to 40% profit from the paper.
Well, you're really into the business of journalism now, Larry, and it's really, print journalism especially is suffering greatly because of all that. And you know, what did they blame the internet? But that may be true, that may not be true. But that's the business, that's a revenue side. And I agree with you that the more that newsrooms diminish the staff, the less opportunity the readers of newspapers and the viewers of television stations and the listeners of radio stations have to get the news that they need to know. And it's the news hole dies, the number of reporters go off on another way. And I don't know what the future of that is. I do know, though, that when we talk about truth, that's a very difficult subject for a journalist to provide, because all the journalist can do is provide what the journalist finds or reports on or sees. I used to tell my students there is no such thing as objectivity. That's a wonderful goal, but there's no such thing. Because if I cover a story A, and I'm a white middle-class person from the west side of Buffalo, and I cover a story with a black young man my age from the east side of Buffalo, that person's going to see that story in a different light than I see it. That's not saying we're not both reporting the facts that we see, but we just see different facts, and different facts have more importance. So there is no such thing really as objectivity. Everything is colored with subjectivity based on the reporter's life, background, and experiences.
Yeah, I would actually respond to that.
And I think Chuck you want to follow up on that as well, Chuck. Yeah.
Well, let Keith speak.
Okay.
This is me channeling Tom Rosensteel again. So if I sound smart, it's him, not me. But he actually describes, and did this in a long Twitter thread yesterday or the day before. He said objectivity originally developed not as something to describe a person, right? The way you say, you are who you are. You're always going to see things through your eyes. You were in a particular place at a particular time. But he said objectivity wasn't meant to be a description of a person. It was supposed to be a process. It was supposed to be like a scientific method for journalists, that it was supposed to be a way of testing facts, because it actually acknowledged exactly what you just said, Lee, which is the idea that nobody's truly objective as a person. So objectivity as a process was supposed to compensate for that. You were supposed to test your own biases as you went, to check yourself as you go. Like, am I being truly unbiased in looking at this fact? Or how can I filter that through who I am and what I know to be able to put it out there? But what I would argue is objectivity is really not the word we should be debating. I think maybe bias is a good one. But I think objectivity has gotten journalists in trouble. And, as Barry said early on in talking about the history of this, I think the rise of right-wing talk radio and then Fox News on television actually did have a very big influence on the mainstream media. And I think what it's doing is pulling the mainstream media to the right. And when you put the New York Times right of center on the horseshoe, I think you're right in that. And I think what they're doing, or the headline you mentioned that you said was more to the right than you would expect from the liberal reputation of the New York Times, they're responding to critics from the right who are attacking the mainstream media for not being objective. They're using the word objectivity as a sort of cudgel to beat anybody who strays from that. And I think that ends up pulling what would be a real center-left newspaper a little bit more to the right than it would have been otherwise.
Okay, Chuck?
I was just going to comment that the problem of the shrinking news hole and the shrinking news staff has not helped any by the infatuation with trivia, as in recently 2 days of coverage of how Trump walked down the ramp, as though that actually was evidence of something. Whereas if somebody actually watched that carefully, they see when he got to the bottom of the ramp, he walked away almost with a spring in his step like anyone else would. But almost every day, there's some other trivial thing about how somebody looked or what they wore or some other thing like that that is fed by the Twitter universe, which itself then becomes a character of the story, and it just goes on and on and on. And meanwhile, serious things are not being attended to the way they should.
Yeah, and I think Lee and Barry were starting to talk about the business side of journalism, and I think that drives a lot of it too. More people are going to read a story about Trump struggling to go down the ramp than are going to sit down and read something really evaluating one of his policies. So, and Barry in his paper, pointed out that the public doesn't have time to do certain things or doesn't have the interest to do certain things. I often put the onus back on the public that you have to become more responsible consumers of news. So, yeah, we have a couple of questions.
I know there's a couple of questions, but I actually have a bit of a hypothesis that journalists, readers never read the important stuff. And now that we have the analytics to know what they're actually reading, I think that the sports pages, the society pages, those things were always subsidizing State House coverage. That really a very small percentage of people were actually interested in the so-called important news. And so we see a lot more of it. The story I always tell my students is the annual, this is how we're cooking Thanksgiving turkey this year. This year we're covering everything in Cheetos. That was one from 2-3 years ago. Yeah,
and I've seen that. Like Lee and Barry know, my wife Ann and I co-edit this hyper-local newspaper, and we get Google Analytics. And a student will do a really good news story, and it'll get a decent amount of coverage. But like a 2 or 3 paragraph police story or something like that goes through the roof. So yeah. Okay, I think everyone can see the questions, but let me read them from Kevin Doyle. A lot of news organizations have fact-checking pages on their sites. How should these be interpreted, and what are your thoughts on this? Somebody want to kick that off?
I'll just I find them useful. I don't usually rely upon a single fact-checking source, though. I look for another one. And in that vein, I would also just throw in one other comment. I think the worth of a medium can be established by finding out how many people they actually have doing reporting for them. You know, so the New York Times has maybe 1,000 reporters around the world. They used to have a couple thousand. They've had to cut their staff too. But and then you get to some of these Russian news sources on Cyprus or wherever they are that have like 2 writers, and they're writing all the articles. But I like the fact checking. I think it's very helpful. There are fact checkers of fact checkers, and that gets messy too. But I think it still clears up more than it messes up.
Well,
Yes, go ahead. I was just going to say some of our students are, doing a workshop with PolitiFact, and I've been involved with that, and it's a real fascinating process to watch the steps they go through.
And that's what I was going to say. I appreciate the fact checking, because it's not just the fact checking; it's the process. It's showing them how they arrived at on the veracity of whatever issue they're looking at, and that is what is appealing to me, because it shows they did research, and that's not what a lot of reporters do often enough.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd say is I think that what all reporters should be doing. I mean, in a way, I think the fact-checking site is, not that it's extraneous or redundant, but that reporters should be fact-checking all the time. That is what the discipline of journalism is. It is checking to make sure that the facts are correct.
Question for Steph is kind of something I think, along the lines of what we were discussing before. It's like an impossible dream to separate the role of marketing with the drive for profit. Headlines sell papers is an ancient axiom. What would be the perfect world? I mean, how do you, I always say it's kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg. The news organizations write these things or cover certain stories because people want to read them, or people just conditioned to look for, like Chuck said, the trivial item.
Well, the thing that troubles me tremendously is a lot of news organizations now ask the public what they should be reporting. That infuriates me, because journalists are the ones who are deciding what they should cover. I have friends on newspapers that tell me that their importance to the paper is how many clicks their stories get on the web. And to me, that's just absolutely absurd, because it could be a story about the State House, which is critical, and then it could be a story about Trump walking down the ramp, which is not critical. And certainly the one of walking down the ramp is probably going to get more clicks. But does that mean it's more important to the marketing of that organization? I don't think so. I think what's important to the organization is how you get the information, how you present the information, and how you make sure that the information is and I'm going to use the word accurate as possible. And that, I know, is a difficult word to use.
I'd say 2 things in response to that, Lee. I mean, I'd agree with you in the sense that if you're asking the audience what you should be covering for marketing purposes, I think that's a really pernicious road to go down, right? Just to do the thing that people want to read. But on the other hand, I do think journalists should be actively engaged with the public, because there are often things they just don't know that are out there. So you could actually find things that are important, and it's just that the journalists don't know about them yet. So I think there is a good reason to be asking that question too.
Okay. Chuck, where do you stand on this? I kind of have this memory from when we were at the News Tribune, and I think when the Bergen Record bought us, they did some sort of study on what people were interested in, and it came out they're interested in diets, money, and sex. And it's kind of like that really hasn't changed. I think that's what still drives, readers. You need to unmute yourself.
We had a written survey one time that, and one respondent said, my wife thinks that you don't run enough news of interest to women. I think you run too much. That pretty much summed it up.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely true. I think what Steph said there, that you can't really, it's hard to separate those 2 functions. And usually it was a struggle that the newsroom fought, depending on who happened to own the paper at the time and who was running advertising and marketing, and even sometimes circulation, to try to solve that tension between covering the news in as fair a way as you could, and the interests that might be in the other offices. I don't remember who owned the paper when you worked there, Rich, but we had one, family-owned it was family owned until Gannett bought it. And the first family would interfere in news coverage, not before the fact, but after the fact. If people who were friendly with the publisher, showed up in a bad light in a story, the newsroom would hear about it. I have to say that when Malcolm Borg bought the paper, that stopped, because he always exercised very high standards when it came to things like that. And so for the 10 years that he owned it, that sort of thing never happened. Then when Gannett bought it, it was kind of a mixed bag, because they kept changing the leadership. And we had one publisher who absolutely sold out to advertising and marketing interests and was demanding all kinds of practically commercial coverage in the paper, like send a photographer over to the jeweler on the day that the clocks get turned back so he can take a picture of the guy who turns the watches back in that jewelry store. Why? Because he was one of the biggest advertisers in the paper. So we had some real bitter fights over the years between the newsroom and others, including the publishers, over those kinds of issues.
I'd like to point out that I think it was CBS News up until the 80s they were pretty distinct from all other aspects of who was it that owned CBS? Was it just CBS? But my point, let me give an example. I'm often asked at the university how many majors I have under me, and when I'm asked that, I'll say, how many majors does the president have?
I said my battery is dying.
You know, the president has no majors. There are certain parts of an organization that have to carry other parts of an organization. And it seems to me that, they did sports reporting, and they did the financial page, and they did the comics, because those carried the news. But when you get CNN going 24/7 on cable network news, on cable television, how can you compete? Because then you've got to make your news hole larger to cover that, and that leaves less room for profit-making aspects to cover the cost of the news. But it used to be the case that there was a sense of social responsibility in NBC and ABC and CBS and even the New York Times about we can't always expect news to be profitable. We'll let other aspects of the paper, advertising, cover that.
Yeah, some of that is actually legally mandated, right? I mean, the FCC required that you have a public interest component enabled in order to maintain your licensing. But yeah, I mean, it was also. Yeah.
You know, Barry, speaking of that, I had a conversation with the recently retired publisher of the News, a man by the name of Warren Colville, several years ago when I was still the dean. And we were discussing journalism and the importance of journalism. And he was telling me that the most important part of the paper were the ads. And he said people buy the Sunday paper because of all the coupons that they get on Sundays. And I said, you don't understand that it's the newsroom that's the engine that pulls the rest of the paper along. And all those ads in the back, that's fine. But it's the newsroom that really is the crux and the steamship that keeps that thing going. He did not understand that. It was, to him, it was the advertising world, and those coupons on Sunday were the biggest draw for people.
Yeah, just so everyone knows, Chuck had to sign off, and I think we're getting close to wrapping up. I had a message from Phil Payne that his battery was dying, and I checked mine. So I just I changed locations here. But just Lee, you reminded me that big newspaper in New Jersey, the Star Ledger, they used to have a layout where there was an ad that would do almost the entire page. It'd be like the space across the top of the page was there for copy. And the reporters would say, if your story is on top of the Haynes ad, more people are going to read it than any other story, just because of where it was placed. Okay, I think we're wrapping. I think it's been a great discussion. So I want to thank everybody. So just go ahead and I'll give Barry a chance to have the final word, but Lee or Kevin, any final thoughts?
Not really. Thanks for asking me to participate. I enjoyed it tremendously, especially seeing Barry again, because I haven't seen him in a while. And of course you, Rich, too. And Kevin, nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, thanks for having me here, Rich. I think the one thing I'd say is I wish more reporters thought about this issue when they were working, that reporters were aware of their own thought processes. If more reporters were thinking about how they're making their claims, the news would be better. So just good, self-aware reporters with a nice grounding in the liberal arts would be a terrific thing for the world.
Yeah, and I know when I was a reporter, I never had an opportunity, the time to think about that. And when it was great when I went back to get my doctorate, and all of a sudden I could stop and think about why we did all these different things that we did.
But Rich, when you were a reporter, you didn't also have to tweet, and you didn't also have to put it on Facebook. You didn't also have to take video, and you didn't also have to take audio, and you didn't also have to go on the web right away. So these multimedia journalists who have to do all these things within the same span of time that we used to have a lot more time to do a story. So that really tears into somebody trying to really do research and thinking about the depth of what they're reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to tell a story that I had to cover once. It was lightning struck a house in one of the towns we covered, and the few people there were killed. And I went down to cover the story, talked to some neighbors, talked to police, and it was the day when Ann was having lunch with friends of ours who actually were other Bonaventure journalism graduates. So after I got my information, I went over, had lunch with Ann and our friend, went back to the newsroom, called the police for an update, and wrote the story. And had that happened today, I would have had to, as soon as I was at the site, I would be tweeting out information and getting that all done. But I had, several hours before I had to complete the story. So, okay. Steve Coca, our good friend, is on. Steve, I know you just logged on at the end. Do you have anything you'd like to say or ask before we wrap up?
Well, actually, Rich, I wanted to tell everyone that me was me. That was me. And I was Steph. I just renamed myself. So I'm no longer going to be Steph. I'm going to be who I am now. And I'm no longer me. So the me questions were from me. And very great job on the essay. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks,
Excellent.
Steve.
Rich, very good job on this. Thanks for setting it up. And thank you to all the panelists. Great job. Lee, nice seeing you again. And thank you. And Kevin, nice hearing you and talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, see, I saw Steph and assumed it was a Stephanie. I should have thought maybe it was short for Stephen. But
It was Chris McCaughey's daughter.
yeah. Well, with that, like I said, Barry, I'll give you the final word.
I don't want to add anything much. I was grateful to be able to spend this time with people who've made journalism and teaching journalism their profession. I thank you for the opportunity, and it was a pleasure. So, Lee.
Okay. Well, thank you for getting us started. Thanks, people on the panel, people who are online now. I know a couple of people had to sign off, but I think it's a great discussion. Look forward to doing this again. We'll have another new paper on Tuesday. We're not doing a Zoom session next week, but I think the week after that we will. So if you just follow the Giandoli Institute on Facebook, Twitter, we'll be getting the word out about that. And I think this was a great kickoff to the media cross-discipline studies, and hopefully everyone will keep following us again. So again, I'm gonna sign off. Thanks to everybody. Have a great night.
Take care.
Thank you.